As was read for us, those of us who are in the adult class have for months been studying through the life of David and Solomon and are about to complete our discussion of Solomon's reign. And with that, obviously Romans chapter 15 and verse 4 said, "These things are written aforetime were written for our learning, that we, through patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope." So I want us this morning to look at some lessons learned from Solomon's life. Now, we've talked about those in Bible class, and I tried to guard myself a little bit this morning and not preach my sermon twice for those who are in the class. But there are some valuable things that we can learn about Solomon. And when you look at what was read for us in this context, the very first thing is wisdom. Solomon understood how important wisdom was. He asked for that before God. He prayed specifically that he might have, and if you were to define wisdom, you understand that wisdom is this quality of knowing, this discernment, this understanding to be able to carry out certain actions, that you have the ability to do that. You understand how things ought to go because you've had life experiences that teaches you so. In Solomon making that request, he indicated that he had the context to exercise wisdom because he reflected before God, as was read for us, that here's how you treated my father David, and here's how my father David responded to you in obedience and uprightness and in righteousness, to keep thy word and thy commandments. And then he asked specifically, give thy servant. He even admitted, I'm like a little child. This is the relationship my father had with you. This is what I saw from a distance and how my father obeyed you. And this is how I saw from a distance how you blessed my father. But I'm like a little child. I don't have that lifelong experience of going in and coming out. But now I am responsible for this, thy great people. So when you look at this, he makes a request for that wisdom. He wants God to give him an understanding heart. It's important to him that he have that relationship with God so he can really, truly understand how to carry out the actions with the people of God the way he should. And that's important, isn't it? We're told in James chapter 1 in those first 3 verses that if any man lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not. So God wants to grant that prayer. He wants to give us an understanding heart, but we have to take that context of what we know about God and who God is and what God has instructed and then make application of that. That discerning heart is to use that wisdom, to exercise that wisdom based on our experience with God to say it's His judgment, it's His statutes, it's His commandments that we are to exercise. What Solomon asked for, you and I can have. James says, if any man ask for wisdom. Now, our understanding sometimes of that passage is that God kind of opens up heaven and He puts a funnel on our head and He just endues us with wisdom that we just, all of a sudden now we understand. That wasn't the context that Solomon's praying in, and that's not the context he's asking us to pray in. You see, in both cases, it's talking about our relationship with God and what God expects of us. And when you read a little further in the book of James, it placed back in that context. First of all, in 17 it said, we need to remember that every good and every perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, in whom there is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. The consistency of God's care over us is obvious. There's no other source of goodness and direction and care and compassion other than from God. And God desires to share that with us. But you continue to read in James chapter 1, and it said, wherefore, lay apart all filthiness and superfluity of naughtiness, here it is, and receive with meekness the engrafted word, which is able to save your souls. And then it describes, folks, that don't practice wisdom. Because if any man is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a person who beholds his natural face in a glass. He has access to all the knowledge. It's revealed to him how he looks and the changes that ought to be made, but he looks into that mirror and he goes his way and he straightway forgetteth what manner of man he was or what manner of man he saw. Now we would say that's not very wise, is it? Sometimes we even say to each other in kind of a cruel way, do you not have a mirror? What are we saying? Hey, if you see what I see, you'd make some corrections. You know, sometimes the way people dress say, do they not have a mirror? I mean, they really think they look good in that? Really? Now what we're saying is, if you look and saw, it ought to reveal to you truth and reality. From a spiritual standpoint, if we're asking for wisdom the way Solomon asked for wisdom, see, the same source of wisdom is God. And God has revealed for us how He wants us to live, what He wants us to do, and Solomon is asking in this humble, childlike spirit, I want to do this right. I want to do this according to Thy will and Thy purpose, because I recognize these are Thy people. James continues in James chapter 1 and said we're not to be forgetful hearers, but doers of the work. For whosoever looketh into the perfect law of liberty and continueth therein, being not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this man shall be blessed in his deeds. Not the last chapter that James deals with that wisdom. In chapter 3, he talks about the things of the world and how envious they are and how lustful they are and how destructive they are. But then he says in verse 17, but the wisdom that is from above. Now what kind of wisdom is Solomon asking for? The kind of wisdom that's from above. And so James said that the wisdom from above is first of all pure, and then peaceful, gentle, easy to be entreated. And that is, when you look at how God has revealed things, we understand that it's pure. The wisdom from above is pure. It's for our good. It's for our understanding of who God is, and God's pure. Like James said in James chapter 1, every good and every perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights. So the wisdom is pure wisdom. And Solomon was praying for pure wisdom. He was sincere about it. He wanted to do the right thing in the right way for the people of God so that they could be right with God. He was pure about that. He wanted that kind of wisdom. And that's what he prayed for. And James continues in that context and says it's without partiality and without hypocrisy. That's the kind of wisdom from above. So if we're learning lessons from Solomon, we say, we ought to pray for wisdom. And he said, anyone who desires wisdom, everyone who desires wisdom can ask of the Father. And He's willing and ready to give it fully, completely, abundantly, and upbraideth not. He doesn't want to withhold anything from us. But in that process of wisdom, we have to take it and use it. Because what you and I learned from Solomon is he had the wisdom. God blessed him with an understanding of His statutes and His judgments and the governance of His people that had not been had by anyone else before him. Nor, it said, would have anyone who came after him would have that kind of full understanding. We see wisdom is that experience, exercising not just a collection of knowledge. Solomon wasn't just wise, but he had a context to place that knowledge in to carry out God's will. When you look at what it was revealed to us in this chapter, you get a little further along and they bring to Solomon two women who are described as harlots. And they both have children. And one of them's child dies, and in the night she takes her dead child and places it alongside her female house partner and takes a live child to herself, and when the mother wakes up and starts to nurse her child, she recognizes this is not her child. But the corpse of the dead child is in her arms, in her bed, and she recognizes this is not my child. So they bring that to Solomon, and the very first experience you and I have in that context is they say, look, you've got to decide whose child it is. There's no witnesses in the house. Nobody can really distinguish. Both of these mothers claim this live child. Now you decide. And Solomon, in his wisdom, says, bring me a sword. Takes a live child and said, divide the child, give each of them half. Well, immediately that clears the matter up, doesn't it? You see, the wisdom, the understanding, the discernment is a true parent of that child. A mother who loves that child, who had that child in her bosom, who gave birth to that child. That mother would protect a child with her own life. So one of them said, no, give her the child. The real mother of the child said, give it to her. She'd rather the child live than for her to prove that is my child. But the one who had tried to deceive said, no, half the child. You see, now the wisdom, the discernment is no mother who loved their child would cause that child's death. What would that have proven? What would that have done? So we each had half the child. It's a dead child. And so in that context, we have a visual of the discernment, the judgment, the understanding, the application of those matters in Solomon. And that fame of Solomon spread, saying, this is a wise man. But what we've learned in our study together is he didn't always exercise that wisdom. As we continued to read and look at Solomon's life, he had an understanding of the statutes and judgments of God. He often rehearsed those. We have more writings from Solomon and the Old Testament than any other inspired writer. It just oozes out of him. And a lot of the things that Solomon wrote, we don't even have record of today. He wrote about plants and about trees and about everything that surrounded him. He observed it. He watched it. He saw how it worked. He wrote it down. He shared it with people. And so his wisdom spreads throughout the kingdom. But along the way, he didn't exercise that discernment. And the commandments and the statutes of God, he disobeyed. We'll talk about that more tonight, but I wanted to make sure we understand that when you look at Solomon and his request for wisdom, discernment, beautiful request. But we read in our class this morning where he didn't keep the statutes and judgments and commandments of God. Now he prayed that he might be able to judge this thy great people, but it said he caused the hearts of the people to turn away from God. So we have to exercise that wisdom. You can't just ask for it. You've got to be able to exercise it. And that's like looking into that perfect law of liberty. You've got to continue therein and be not a forgetful hearer. He was a forgetful hearer of what God revealed to him and the wisdom that God shared with him. Now, the second thing is we see and learn from Solomon's work. Boy, he carried out a lot of works, didn't he? And just like when you look at wisdom, you're talking about this quality of knowledge and discernment that is exercised in a way to accomplish God's will. The work we're talking about here is to be able to understand and to recognize a discharge of purpose. It was David's purpose to build a house for God. They had the tabernacle that God designed that they moved about. It was in tent form. And it was just like God wanted it to be, and it had all the utensils in it, and it was designed just like God wanted it to be so that they could come and offer their sacrifices and worship God. And David wanted to take the dimensions of that tabernacle and build a permanent place. You know, they dwelt in tents and moved about in the sojourn, and so he thought, now we're in in the land and we have houses that are structures that are permanent, we want a permanent place to represent our relationship with God. David wanted to do that, and God didn't allow him because he was a man of war. And so when Solomon's exercising his wisdom, he goes before God and says, I want to build that house for you that my father wanted to build. And his work, his purpose, was to carry that out. And you and I read, those class read how detailed and how focused and how purposeful he was in building that house, and how reverent he was in accomplishing that task. He wanted to make sure that that was done in honor of God. And he followed all those dimensions and all those purposes, and he consulted with God all along the way. And he made sure he reminded the priest and the people, and before they were able to worship in that house, he called the attention of the people in the presence of God and said, this is God's house. And here's what our relationship to God had to be. We have to keep his commandments and his statutes, and this was his work, his purpose. We understand in a spiritual sense that Jesus understood work and purpose, didn't he? In John chapter 9 and verse 4, Jesus said, I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day, for the night cometh when no man shall work. So we understand work means putting forth effort and energy, but it also means that effort and that energy has purpose, has a direction, so that you have some way to measure it and say, purpose accomplished, goal reached, project finished. Well, that was true in the building of God's house. It was finished. And it tells us that it took 7 years for the building of the house of God. 14 in the broad sense of the term where this project was going on. And so here's this effort of saying, look, Solomon's going to build his house. He's going to amass this great kingdom. But his first focus was to build this house of God. That was a work. And that work was, according to that purpose of the wisdom that he wanted, to judge this thy great people. And this relationship that his people would have to him in this worship of God. That becomes important. Work could be just a task you and I decide to do that draws attention to us. Solomon wanted to draw attention to God in the work he was carrying out with the building of the temple. And Ephesians chapter 2 said, our relationship to God is based on the grace that God's extended. That we're saved by that grace that God has extended. It's not of works, lest of any man should boast. So we're not talking about works here that you and I would decide God's going to be impressed with this. That's not the kind of work we're talking about. We're talking about the purpose of God. God already told them, here's how you're going to worship me. And you're going to worship me in the tabernacle. And so the work was to carry out that building of that house with purpose, that would keep them connected to God. That's who you and I ought to be in our relationship of carrying out that purpose. In Revelation chapter 14 and verse 13, John heard a voice from heaven saying, write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. Henceforth they shall rest from their labors. Now work has to do with labor and toil, doesn't it? They shall rest from their labors, and listen, their works do follow them. The finished product, having carried out the purpose of being faithful to God, doing the work of God, not the work of man. As Jesus said, I must work the works of him that sent me. Having done that, the works of him who governs our lives spiritually, they'll follow us. They'll be there for God to say, they did what I told them to do. That's the wisdom, that's the understanding, that's the lesson we learn from Solomon's, not only his wisdom that he asked for, but the work that he carried out. The third place, the worship that he conducted. When the house was built, it was a house of worship. And there was a particular way they had to worship. There were specific sacrifices that had to be offered. And Solomon amassed all those sacrifices, not only he himself as a king, but he got all the people, and they had this huge dedication of the permanent place of worship, the temple, and they worship God. When we talk about worship, we're talking about a reverence toward deity. He recognized who God was, and why these sacrifices had to be offered, how they had to be offered, who offered them. Solomon understood all that. He exercised that discernment, that wisdom of saying, God's instructed us. God's told us. God's been specific about it. The work has been accomplished for this place of permanent worship to be erected in Jerusalem. But it's a place of worship. And worship is showing reverence to Him. Now, here's what He said would please Him. Here's what He commanded us to do. And they offer those sacrifices. In a New Testament sense, in John chapter 4 and verse 24, when Jesus is talking to the woman at the well in John chapter 4, He asked her about their place of worship. And she asked Him, our fathers say, in this mountain, Mount Gerizim, is a place to worship. The Samaritans, that's where they worship. You Jews say that Jerusalem is a place to worship. Where is the place to worship? He said there's coming an hour when neither in this mountain, Mount Gerizim, nor in Jerusalem going to be the place to worship. The more important thing is, here's what you need to know. God is a spirit, and they that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. It won't matter the location. It doesn't have to be in Jerusalem. It certainly wouldn't be in Mount Gerizim as an idolatrous place of worship. But it'll be wherever you are, here's how you're going to worship. God is a spirit. When the house of God was dedicated, God demonstrated His presence. Now, He didn't show up as a physical being for them to say, oh, that's God. But the presence of God was demonstrated, and His presence in that house was reverenced. When they ceased to do that, then they ceased to be able to worship, because God's a spirit. And they that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. When Paul walked through the streets of Athens in Acts chapter 17, he saw all manners of places to worship, of places to worship, all kinds of altars built. And he saw one to the unknown God. And he paused and said, Him I declare unto you. And he reminded them, it is in Him we live and move and have our being. And you grope after Him. He's describing in a sense that they're like blind people. They're going about and feeling and trying to get some kind of form in their mind to say, is this God? Is this God? Is this God? He said, you grope after Him, though He be not far from any of us. Then how do we know Him? God's a spirit. And they that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. That discernment Solomon was praying for, the lessons we learn is that comes only from God. And God has revealed His wisdom through His statutes and His judgments. So when you know God's statutes and judgments, and you don't become a forgetful hearer, but a doer of those works, you've got the wisdom, the understanding of what God would have you to do, you carrying out His purpose and His will. And if you look into that perfect law of liberty and you continue therein, it makes you not to be a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work. And then he said, pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and the widows in their afflictions, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. That allows us to be wise in our relationship to God and carrying out His will and His purpose, and to make sure that it's His work that we're focused on, and that we offer unto Him the worship that He's asked for. And that can only become clear and true through the wisdom we gain from knowing His will. You can't grope about. You can't just guess at it. You can't just build an altar and say, this is to God. You have to listen to what God said, to His truth that He's revealed, and say, this is what He said would please Him. This would recognize His deity. This would show reverence and respect through His commandments. This is what He will accept. This is what's required. These are valuable lessons to learn, aren't they? They were written for a specific purpose, so that you and me, through that comfort of the Scriptures, to gain that understanding, that knowledge, so that we can exercise that discernment in the application of those principles to our lives. And it doesn't stop just in our worship. Paul said in Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy, listen to it, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service, being not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your minds. You want that wisdom? By the renewing of your minds, that you might prove what is that good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. All that we as His people might ask for, receive, and practice that wisdom to accomplish His work and His purpose. And to be able to come together like we have on this day and offer unto Him our pure worship. If we can help and assist you to do that, here's what you've got to do to make sure that you're right with God. His will and His purpose requires us to believe that Jesus is His very Son. And through that sonship, that deity, that He has the right to command us to turn away from our sins, to lay apart all filthiness and superfluity of naughtiness, and that we would with our own lips confess that He is the very Son of God, that we would humble ourselves and receive that wisdom from above and be immersed into Him to wash away our sins, so that we could be just and justified in His eyes. That's what He revealed to us. That's what can be true of you this morning. That's how wisdom is exercised. Those of us who've done that, one lesson we learned from Solomon is he did not continue to do that. And that James passage ought to echo in our ear. Whosoever looketh into the perfect law of liberty and continueth therein, being not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this man shall be blessed in his deeds. If we fall short of that, if we confess that, He will be faithful and just to forgive us of that, and we get to start all over. You can do that now as we stand and as we sing.